Coming up on Mississippi Roads, we take to a road, one specific highway that we travel end to end, at least the part of it that's in Mississippi. A highway that traverses much of our geography, history, and culture. Old bluesmen called it the longest road they knew.
Down Mississippi Road, Mississippi Road.
Hi, welcome to Mississippi Roads. I'm your host, Walt Grayson. You know, here a while back, it occurred to me that with a show titled Mississippi Roads, occasionally we need to take a whole half hour and travel up or down an entire Mississippi road. And that's what we're going to do today. And the road we picked is Highway 61. Although you might associate Highway 61 more with the Delta and the blues, we're coming into Highway 61 where it lifts up out of Louisiana into southern Mississippi just south of Woodville. Highway 61 cuts through a wide variety of Mississippi geography, across a good deal of Mississippi culture, and has witnessed Mississippi history from the colonial period all the way up until today. And it has a lot of lore and tales associated with it, and we'll see how many of those tales we can include, too. There's an old blues song. I hear it on MPB radio in the promo for the blues music program, which interestingly enough is entitled Highway 61, in which the singer mournfully tells us that Highway 61 is the longest road he knows. It runs from New Orleans northward along the Mississippi River for 1,400 miles. It goes through Memphis and St. Louis on the way. And it was the first leg out of the Delta toward Chicago in the Great Migration between the World Wars. So it is a long highway, and that's just in length. And over 300 miles of that 1,400 is in Mississippi. And considering all it touches, and crosses, and connects just here, it is a very long highway in spirit, too. Before we travel too far away from where we are, though, let's say something about the spot we're standing in. The state line here south of Woodville in Wilkinson County, not only is it a state line today, but back in colonial days, this used to be an international boundary. To the north of us was the United States. To the south of us was Spanish West Florida. The 31st parallel, which is now the Mississippi-Louisiana state line, was the southwest corner of the United States where it met the Mississippi River back in the late 1700s. And that led to the establishment of what used to be one of the most important forts in the nation, Fort Adams, in the western part of Wilkinson County, just north of the 31st parallel, on a high hilltop overlooking the Mississippi River. Fort Adams was the country's first line of defense inside the borders of the nation against any invader attempting to come up the Mississippi River from French territory and then Spanish territory. But after the Louisiana Purchase, well, all of that land became a part of the United States, and Fort Adams almost immediately became an obsolete inland fort that didn't protect much of anything in particular, and it's long since vanished. A little village grew up around the fort, and it survived, but the recent 21st century superfloods on the Mississippi River have pretty much erased what was left of it. So Highway 61 rises up out of what used to be foreign territory until 1803 out of Louisiana and enters Mississippi here with its southernmost part running through remote Wilkinson County. And the population of Wilkinson County and its county seat Woodville is almost identical to what it was 150 years ago during the Civil War. Although there are strong associations with the Civil War here, the Union Army having burned some homes in the county, and Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy's boyhood home, Rosemont Plantation, is just east of Woodville. There are still stronger colonial period and statehood period associations here. Now, for instance, the Territorial Bank was located in Woodville. The building still stands and today houses the Woodville African American Museum. There's an extensive exhibit about American composer William Grant Still in the African American Museum in Woodville. He was born here. And his classic composition, Afro-American Symphony, just happens to be one of my favorites. Now, on the other side of the square, now housing the Historical Society Museum, is the old headquarters and bank building for the West Feliciana Railroad. Now, the system was only 28 miles long, connecting Woodville to Balsera Landing in St. Francisville, Louisiana. But in 1828, when it was built, it carried a couple of firsts. First, Interstate Railroad, and the first standard gauge railroad. It was built primarily to haul cotton from South Mississippi to the river landing at Balsera, Louisiana. And if it's in Woodville, it's just about the oldest of whatever it is in the state. The oldest Baptist church building in the state is here, Woodville Baptist Church. Jefferson Davis's mother was a member of the Episcopal Church. The state's oldest newspaper, the Woodville Republican, is here, still in operation, which makes it not only the oldest newspaper, but also the state's oldest continuously operated business, established in 1823. Some of the state's most beautiful wilderness is in Wilkinson County. At Pond, southwest of Woodville, is Clark Creek. The state-owned natural area has several waterfalls, and it's a pretty good hike in and out, so if you plan on coming and seeing Clark Creek, plan on making a day of it. But our destination is a long way that way, and if we're ever going to make Memphis in just a half hour, we're going to have to get a move on. Northward, out of Woodville, Highway 61 drops into some pine and hardwood forest lands and crosses some wide river bottoms. The Homochitto and Buffalo rivers cut under the highway as they flow westward to the Mississippi below Natchez. Just east of Highway 61 on closer to Natchez is Kingston. Now, there's several interesting things about it. It started out known as the Jersey Settlement. Members of the King and Swayze families settled here from New Jersey prior to the American Revolution because, among other reasons, they were loyalists to England. And it was getting more and more uncomfortable for loyalists to stay along the Atlantic seaboard prior to the Revolution. And there were a lot of loyalists, or Tories as they were called, who came to the Natchez District because of the Revolutionary War. And here's another first. Roots of the Kingston Methodist Church go back to the days when England still controlled this part of the country, and Kingston Methodist was the first Protestant church in Mississippi. Now, this building was built decades later, but it's still old. It's from the 1850s. And so far, we've talked about things that happened back in the colonial era or earlier, or early statehood on our trip up Highway 61. And obviously, all of that was way before Highway 61 was ever needed or thought of, much less built. But just before we get into Natchez, we run across our first icon directly associated with the early days of the highway itself, Mammy's Cupboard. It's one of those buildings whose design somehow suggests its function. Mammy's Cupboard is a restaurant. Now, about the time Americans began to hit the roads as tourists, places like this sprang up to catch the eye of motorists so they'd pull in. And she's shaped like an old Southern cook. And good cooking is what you get here. Open for lunch Tuesday through Saturday. And my suggestion is skip the lunch and go straight for the dessert. We're traveling up Highway 61 this week on Mississippi roads. We started down at Woodville at the Louisiana-Mississippi state line, and now we're in Natchez. And as we get to Natchez, we kind of get to the antebellum period of history in the state. A time of plantations and opulence and riches for some people. But as we get here, I'm also reminded of this place, just right off of Highway 61, the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians, which is a reminder that people have been here for a long, long time. And this is a very old country. Not only is it old, with the Native Americans having arrived here 10 to 15,000 years ago, give or take, according to which expert you're asking, it's a complicated place too. Because we already mentioned that after the Native Americans came the French, and then the English, and then the Spanish, then the United States. Well, it's not like all the predecessors cleanly moved out when the new proprietor moved in, like moving into a new house. No, when the new folks got here, oftentimes some of the old folks stayed, or they moved back later. Consequently, that left land claims in the southwest part of the state more complicated than Howard Hughes' will. This was Indian land to begin with, but then the King of France handed out homesteads here too. Then after the French and Indian War, when the British got ownership of the old French territory, the King of England passed out parcels. And even the colony of Georgia doled out lots in this area. Then Spain got it after the American Revolution and subdivided it again. Same with the United States when it ultimately became the Mississippi Territory. Much of that mess is what was sorted out prior to statehood in the Natchez area. The land here is desirable because it's high on another type geography that Highway 61 cuts through. That's the bluffs. Geologists say this type soil was blown in here when the Ice Age glaciers out west started melting, and the ground-up rock dust that was in them was caught by the prevailing westerlies, settled here. It's all topsoil, 300 to 400 feet deep. Roads cut through the bluffs and get lost in the bottom of the cuts. Hardwoods cover them in the rural areas, and in many places, kudzu covers the hardwoods. Now, Natchez started out as a trading center and a river port on the Mississippi River. As cotton took over, most of the great plantations migrated across the Mississippi into the fertile Louisiana side of the river. And as the owners grew wealthy, they built their fine homes on the bluffs in Natchez, where living was more genteel. And as the city grew wealthier, more and more huge homes were built here. This was true in other areas of the state too, but a twist of fate, the Civil War, left Natchez without Confederate fortifications in any great degree, so therefore the Union Army, with a few individual exceptions, didn't see any great need to destroy the city, leaving Natchez with over 500 antebellum structures today. Many of the old homes are on tour during the spring and autumn pilgrimage, and some of them, like Melrose, part of the National Park System, are open year-round. Now, Natchez was the first capital of the Mississippi Territory, and if you remember your American history, the Mississippi Territory at that time included all of what is now Mississippi and Alabama. And here, the capital was located just about as far to the southwest as you could get. So there arose a call to move the capital and get it away from all of that river influence. So it was moved to the next little village up Highway 61, to the town of Washington, Mississippi, 6 miles inland from all that river influence. Now, realizing 6 miles was a lot farther back then than it is today, but still, 6 miles? A couple of blocks off Highway 61 at Washington is Jefferson College. It was the first anything to be chartered by the territorial legislature, which, by the way, that legislature met in a tavern just around the corner. That building burned in the early 1990s. Jefferson Davis was a student here, and naturist illustrator John James Audubon taught here for a short while. The school is owned by the Department of Archives and History and is open year-round. There are periodic living history events here, and even a neat little museum here. But we continue our trek northward up Highway 61, and not far out of Washington, the road intersects with the oldest road in Mississippi, the Natchez Trace. And the trace started out thousands of years ago as animal trails, perhaps, and then people started using those animal trails and interconnecting them until this became a prehistoric superhighway. In the settlement days of America, flatboatsmen poled with the current down the Mississippi, sold their goods, and then walked back home on the Natchez Trace. And the roadway fell out of popularity in 1811 with the invention of the steamboat that could go against the current on the big river. Well, now it's a modern national parkway, and if one were a mind to, you could drive in a day. Now, admittedly, it'd be a long day, but you could do it. You could drive it in a day, what would have taken walkers a month or more to travel. Getting back to Highway 61, continuing to travel to the north, the next town past the trace is Fayette. And Fayette is of note because Fayette is the first town in Mississippi in modern times to elect a black mayor. Charles Evers, back in 1969, was elected after passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1964. By the way, he was a graduate of Alcorn State University, which is also just a few miles west of Highway 61. And the turnoff to Alcorn is at Lorman. And Lorman is where you need to stop to get a taste of the best fried chicken in the world. At the old country store at Lorman, Mr. D makes it from his grandmother's recipe. And people from all over the nation, and for that matter all over the world, have flocked here to get a taste of it. Now turn east at Lorman off 61 and go to Red Lick, and if you know where you're looking, you can find the grave of a man buried standing up. His reason? He didn't want to have to wait to climb out of his grave on Resurrection Day. He just wanted to walk out standing. And that's something else you'll find along Highway 61, and that's a strong faith in God. You'd have to have faith in something bigger than yourself to survive the early days out here. Slaves in the old plantation days had to have faith that a better day was coming. And some of the prettiest churches in the state erected to show tangibility to that faith are along the highway in the next town up the road, Port Gibson. The Presbyterian Church, with the famous hand pointing toward heaven on the top of the steeple, is here. The Catholic Church, with its cobalt blue window panes, gives the interior of the church a heavenly glow on bright sunlit days. Lore has it that when General Grant landed his army west of here at Bruinsburg at the onset of his march toward Vicksburg in the Civil War, after camping in the cornfields of Windsor, whose ruins are less than 10 miles west of Port Gibson, just off of Highway 61, when Grant saw the town, he said it was too beautiful to burn. And here it stands today. Well, most of it. A lot of it's fallen in due to old age since then. I mentioned Vicksburg. Well, that's the next town up from Port Gibson, past the Big Black River, some 25 miles away. And at Vicksburg, we're back out of the hardwood river bottoms and back on top of the bluffs again, and back in time to the Civil War. I think it's odd that when they were taking a vote on whether Mississippi should follow South Carolina and secede from the Union or not, Warren County's delegation from Vicksburg voted to stay in. That didn't make a lot of difference to General Grant. There wasn't an unbroken window pane left in the city after Grant's 47-day siege and constant bombardment that left much of the town in ruins in 1863. The fall of Vicksburg was a turning point in the Civil War. For all practical purposes, when Vicksburg fell, the war was lost for the South. Of course, it went on for another couple of years. The siege is documented in the Vicksburg National Military Park. Well, as we continue up Highway 61, traveling northward out of Vicksburg, the character of our journey changes entirely. Back where we've been, we're going to leave the bluffs, the gullies, and all the bayous and antebellum world, all that behind us. And where we're heading is into the Mississippi Delta. Now I'll admit, it's with a little fear and trepidation that I try to write anything about the Delta. Mainly because it's culturally a deceivingly complicated place in comparison to its flatness. There's many social and economic levels that have to function independent of and dependent on each other at the same time here that it would make an anthropologist change majors. Another reason I don't want to get too deep into the Delta, some of the best have already taken a whack at it. William Faulkner spit out quite a few paragraphs about the contradictions built into the fabric of the Delta. So did Eudora Welty. And I think there's a little bit of Delta in everything Willie Morris wrote, even if he wasn't writing about the Delta, because the Delta was where he was raised. Well, half Delta, half hills in Yazoo City. But when you're from here, the Delta and its mores and values become the unconscious reference point from which you judge the rest of your life experiences. But back to Highway 61. One of the first little villages you come to, traveling northward on 61 coming into the Delta from the south, is Valley Park. Former powerful Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives C.B. Buddy Newman lived here. Buddy saved a mile-long stretch of track out behind his house when they came through the Delta ripping up rails. He had a few railroad cars put there, reminder of his childhood. And his motor car that he once told me, as he put it, that he and the other children of Valley Park like to ride in, sits idle. Like the rest of the Delta, it's drastically changed since the days in which it was functioning. A quick note, Highway 61 intersects one of the most important smaller waterways in the Delta at Valley Park, Deer Creek. Native Americans used it as a highway. Many of their mounds are located along it. Matter of fact, the first leg of Mississippi's new Mound Trail highlights Indian mounds primarily along Highway 61. And not only at prehistoric times were the waterways the highways, but even the early Delta settlers built along the waterways. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the interior of the Delta began to be cleared. That's when those railroads Buddy Newman loved so much came into play, hauling out the timber and then carrying passengers. Deer Creek parallels the lower portion of Highway 61 through the Delta. It usually is the centerpiece of towns through which it runs. Leland decorates it for Christmas. To an extent, so does Anguilla. Rolling Fork Creek intersects Deer Creek at Rolling Fork, and at Rolling Fork, another of the Delta's contributions to the world is celebrated every year with the Great Delta Bear Affair. And that contribution? The teddy bear. And the story's told pretty good at Onward, just south of Rolling Fork, about Teddy Roosevelt's early 20th century bear hunt here. That resulted in Roosevelt refusing to shoot a bear that guide Holt Collier lassoed, resulting in a cartoon in the Washington Post and a New York toy maker coming out with a line of toys that they named Teddy's Bears. Contributions of the Delta. Well, we've already touched on writers. Of the contributions, obviously blues music. It was born in the Delta. Dockery Plantation between Highway 61 and 49 lays claim to being the cradle of the blues because of the lenient policies allowing field hands working there to have gatherings and music jams. Anyone you've ever heard of being one of the founders of the blues learned something from someone at Dockery. Clarksdale is probably considered the epicenter of Delta blues today, with its blues festivals and the Delta Blues Museum right across the street from Morgan Freeman and Bill Luckett's Ground Zero's Blues Club. Leland has a blues museum too, and a mural of Lelanders who contributed to the art form, from Son Thomas to Johnny Winter. Speaking of Leland, another Delta gift of the world, Kermit the Frog. Creator Jim Henson was born in Greenville and spent his younger years playing along the banks of Deer Creek in Leland, no doubt running across many sizable bullfrogs in the process. Way up north, the casinos tell you where the river is as their hotels tower over the cotton fields, and more likely cornfields now. Corn's taken over so much that the Delta looks like Kansas in the summertime. That brings up the point that at the base of the Delta is agriculture. Oh, there's the manufacturing here. Not as much as it used to be, but when you're sitting on the richest farmland in America, your base has got to be growing things. An old-time Delta planter told me when we were at his place one Sunday morning years ago shooting a Mississippi Road story that one man on a tractor by himself could do what it used to take 10 families sharecropping to do. And he went on to say the problem with the Delta is the 10 families are still there with nothing to do. There's a contradiction of the Delta. Progress is choking it. But not to progress would be instant death. It's hard to equate the fading away of small towns that used to be the supply centers for the old plantations as progress. But the way of doing agriculture has changed so much that they're obsolete. You don't have to have small towns to supply anything anymore. And that hurts the big towns that grew up supplying the small towns. And that contradiction and having to live with it and make a living in it causes the kind of headache and heartache that created the fertile ground from which the blues sprang. And we're nearing the end of our journey and never got to mention the Levee and Hot Tamales or any of the other musicians from the Delta like Ike Turner and how rock and roll has deep roots here too. Maybe sometime we can come do a whole show about the Delta. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey. We started, according to my GPS, about 321 miles ago to the south as we came across the Louisiana state line heading north. Tennessee state line's right over there, and we've traveled Highway 61 the entire distance. A highway that's cut across just about every geographical and cultural feature that we have in the state of Mississippi, which underscores that Highway 61 is about the longest road I know. More information at mpbonline.org/Mississippi Roads, and like us on our Mississippi Public Broadcasting Facebook page. I'm Walt Grayson. I'll be seeing you on Mississippi Roads.
Mississippi Roads is made possible in part by the generous support of viewers like you. Thank you.